Hello, and welcome to the February 11th, 2026 meeting of the Governmental Accounting Standards Board. Great to have everybody back today. We had a great, productive board meeting yesterday. We didn't object to the release of an exposure draft of an implementation guide. It's good. We also made a lot of progress on our infrastructure assets project, reviewing a pre-ballot draft, moving towards a ballot draft next meeting of an exposure draft, and had a lot of good discussions on our going concern severe financial stress project. That leaves two technical topics for today, the first of which is our cybersecurity pre-agenda research area activity, where we have a report from our team on the results of that research. And so, Joe, I'll turn it over to you to kind of help walk us through the research.
All right. Thank you, Joel. Good morning, everyone. So, cybersecurity risk disclosure, pre-agenda research. I'd say in December 2024, the board had approved this pre-agenda research proposal about looking into cybersecurity risk disclosures. We had three objectives. The first being the types of cybersecurity threats faced by state and local governments, whether and how those are disclosed in financial statements, and whether financial reporting guidance has the potential to address user needs for this information. And the intent for our discussion today is to discuss some of our findings related to the three research objectives and to provide the board with some takeaways on this topic to consider, because we'll be coming back to the board later this spring with a project prospectus. Before we get into the research objectives, I wanted to highlight some items from the research methodology. We reviewed financial statements of two mutually exclusive samples of governments, looking at ones that had been the victims of cybersecurity incidents and ones that had, as far as we could find, not been the victims of cybersecurity incidents. The intent was to get at, what kind of information governments might be disclosing if it's very front of mind because they had recently been attacked, or in situations where maybe apropos of nothing other than the general cybersecurity environment have information to provide. And so, out of that review, you'll note in the paper, we were able to provide some examples of the types of information and level of detail we observed some governments providing about cybersecurity. We also had some great conversations with different types of stakeholders. This is something the board had specifically requested in December 2024 when it approved this research project. It wasn't in the proposal, but it was an excellent recommendation. We got a ton of value out of those discussions. In addition to users and preparers, folks that were interested in cybersecurity, we also met with individuals who are responsible for cybersecurity efforts to get their unique perspective. We've also consumed quite a bit of literature on this. There's a lot of stuff out there. When you look at the accounting literature, you don't really see cybersecurity. You might see an instance of cyber risk in the basis for conclusions to Statement 102, but that's about it when we kind of look broadly across standard setters. We also looked at a lot of cybersecurity terminology, definitions, frameworks, and guidance, such as the National Institute of Standards and Technology, because we wanted to be very specific and very intentional in the language we use when talking about cybersecurity. As we'll discuss later, there are some considerations and potential, challenges related to how some of those terms are already used or interpreted in practice. We'll get into that a little bit more in Objective 3. State legislation, other compliance requirements such as data breach notifications, open public record exemptions, looking at things like the CIS's proposed CIRSA rules, looking at the SEC's 2023 cyber rules, other publications related to maturity of cybersecurity posture of state and local governments, and other relevant professional publications and academic research. We really looked at quite a bit because it's a very front of mind topic for a lot of folks, not just the governments. And so there's a lot of good material out there to consume. And so for the sake of time, I'm going to try to keep moving, but I'll try to highlight certain of those items as we go, when relevant for something we might be discussing on a specific objective. And I would say, I think for the sake of time today, or for the sake of the discussion, we'll plan on turning it over to the board after each of the three objectives versus waiting all the way to the end in case the board has any questions, concerns, or feedback for the staff for that specific objective. So the first objective, to determine the types of cybersecurity threats faced by state and local governments, we began by looking into cybersecurity incidents, right? From a terminology standpoint, we've intentionally used the broader term cybersecurity incidents instead of cyber attacks. to avoid narrowing the scope of the focus of this type of risk to only malicious forms of cybersecurity incidents. And we observed, again, when we talk cybersecurity incidents, cyber attacks, such terms are already used extensively in practice, sometimes interchangeably, not always consistently. And so I just kind of want to point that out here as a front when we talk about incidents, because we kind of come back to that when we get to objective 3. But we found that state and local governments are exposed to a range of rapidly evolving cybersecurity threats that can result in several effects. There's a long, long list of different types of incidents out there, right? Ransomware, malware, denial of service, phishing, spear phishing, spoofing, business email compromise. We could rattle off a bunch of different types of attacks. But the evolutionary effect of artificial intelligence likely means that list is going to keep growing as time goes by. And so to facilitate our later efforts for objective 3 in understanding areas of potential for financial reporting, we really focused on the effects that these incidents can have and categorize them into 4 groups. First being theft of governmental resources, right? For example, a government suffers a ransomware attack and pays a ransom demand, or a threat actor impersonates a government official through a business email compromise scam and diverts resources through a wire fraud. In either case, threat actors motivated by financial gain have stolen resources of the government. Also, breaches of sensitive and confidential data held by governments would be the second one, right? Those types of incidents that result in data breach notifications. Sometimes threat actors are ransoming that data back to the government. Sometimes they're using it for identity theft or to sell it to those who will. So, of this specific effect, this also sometimes subjects governments to litigation, right, from affected individuals whose data was breached. Third is disruption of operations and services provided by governments. Most commonly, this is when ransomware locks up a government's IT systems for a certain period of time and knocks them offline. And the fourth one is reputational harm, right? Those, cybersecurity incidents can result in a government's perceived inability to secure confidential data or call into question its ability to maintain its operations or services. And because of situations like this, rating agencies are increasingly looking at how governments are responding to and recovering from cyber incidents. A cybersecurity incident has potential to expose a government's bond rating to increased scrutiny if that incident calls into question the government's financial condition and ability to meet future financial commitments. And I should note, of those 4 categories, they're not mutually exclusive. A single incident can result in multiple, if not all of those effects. And then lastly, we found that governments often expend resources in responding and recovering from those effects. As I mentioned earlier, too, we observed some variability in the use of terminology in practice, such as cybersecurity incidents and attacks. But also, specifically when we're talking about cybersecurity threats, we also noted there is often a distinction made between whether such incidents are cyber dependent, which means they couldn't exist outside an IT system, or cyber enabled, right? Good old fashioned fraud executed with technology, right? So a ransomware attack is generally a pretty solid example of a cyber dependent incident, but consider a business email compromise, right? Someone is using a stolen email account to impersonate a government official to divert resources. This is typically an example of a cyber-enabled form of incident. It's something that, someone could have done in the past over the phone, through the mail, stuff like that. And so I mentioned that here as we kind of considered some of those incidents, because as we noted, there's some variability also in the line between what is considered cyber-dependent or cyber-enabled in practice, which we'll talk about a little bit more when we get to objective 3. But outside of external factors of cybersecurity risks, we also found that governments have variability in the internal factors that affect the maturity of their cybersecurity posture and their ability to withstand and respond to cybersecurity incidents. Governments generally have a wider attack surface due to the variety and distribution of services they provide, the data they hold, and the critical infrastructure that they're responsible for. They also often face challenges in funding and staffing cybersecurity initiatives. And they also often face challenges regarding the use of legacy IT systems, which they can struggle to upgrade or replace, and has the potential to leave them more exposed to exploitation. And lastly, we also noted through a number of conversations with stakeholders and other professional publications we read that there is some disparity in the cybersecurity postures of state and local governments, right? That is, smaller local governments typically have less mature cybersecurity postures than larger state governments. But that's also not to say that larger state governments are impervious to cybersecurity incidents, right? So, for example, the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center, the MSISIG, they do an annual survey of cybersecurity postures of state and local governments in the context of the NIST's cybersecurity framework. And over 4,000 governments responded to that survey in 2024. And the MSISIG is really looking for a maturity rating on a scale of 1 to 7 of a minimum of 5, right? Which means you have implementation and process. Well, state governments were just above that minimum on average at about a 5.04, and local governments were averaging around a 3.98, meaning that by the MSISIG scale, they're somewhere between a 3, which means they have a documented policy, and a 4, which means they have partially documented standards. But at the end of the day, per the MSISIG scale, they still have a bit of work to do. But I would say, as we kind of get to the end of objective 1 here, a common refrain that we heard from many stakeholders, I mean, it's been most of the stakeholders we talked to, we found that they often describe the realization of cybersecurity threats in terms of when, not if. We heard that phrase quite a bit. And so as we consider the external and internal aspects of cybersecurity risks, we were also very cognizant that the appropriate level of preparedness can be somewhat subjective, right? In that when, not if environment, what is the correct level of preparedness for that thing that stakeholders seem to indicate no one can really be fully prepared for? So anyway, those are some of those takeaways from objective 1 regarding, what threats do governments face. I think at this point we'll pause here in case the board has any comments, questions, or feedback from the staff regarding objective 1.
Thanks, Joe. And I guess I'd like to start with thanking you and the team for a really well done paper. There's a lot of good information in here. It was kind of long, and research papers kind of are long, but every bit of it was kind of helpful and additive. And so I appreciate all the work you did, all the outreach you did, all the ways in which you looked at this and thought about it. It was very, very thorough and well done and presented. So thank you for all that work. Board members, any comments? Or I think Joe's plan is to probably then go through each objective and get, questions or comments about each objective. So on objective 1, any questions for Joe or team or comments? Jackie.
Yeah, I thought the report was really interesting too, team, and I enjoyed reading all of the pages. And so that was something. But did you get any feel for the fact that these small governments obviously don't have the sophistication to be able to necessarily deal with cyber incidents? They don't have the personnel, et cetera, that states are looking to try and build some kind of a consortium or network or something that would help their smaller governments make sure that they have more secure alignment, more cybersecurity tools or resources, or something that would spread the wealth kind of thing to make sure that the smaller governments were getting covered?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we actually had an opportunity to talk to a state chief information security officer, and he did talk about some programs that they would do in their state, right? Acknowledging that smaller governments typically don't have the same level of staffing or even the ability to have that level of staffing. Maybe money not being an issue, even getting those cybersecurity individuals can be a challenge at times. And so there are situations where they would ultimately outsource some of their staff. I think the areas where sometimes it comes into play would be funding those initiatives. Comment we heard from one group is that it can vary how governments fund their cybersecurity initiatives. And so you might have situations where a smaller local government is able to get certain services from a larger government, and it's on a little bit more of an a la carte basis. And then it becomes a matter of, even that being available to them, do they still take advantage of that? But it is something I think that, when you look at state policies, a number of states are not just thinking about themselves, but kind of broadly within their state. Another thing that we saw is that, there are state legislation about cybersecurity issues that are broadly covering governments in that state. I mean, 1 or 2 states where they are very, very specific in what governments are allowed to do with engaging with threat actors and other items. So not just service they provide, but other types of protections that they're trying to do beyond just an extension of just the state's immediate unit.
Thank you.
Chris?
So I also enjoyed the paper and had a little PTSD coming out of my cybersecurity issue from 2025 with our state library. But one of the issues that I was curious to see if it came up, kind of the flip of Jackie's point, is that what we struggle with in our state is that we have a IT infrastructure that's fairly robust, but smaller state agencies that are outside of the network, like our libraries and others, don't want to just be assimilated, right? And so they push back, and there's the state that has the funding to accept everybody under the umbrella, but these individual agencies, quasi-government organizations, et cetera, it appears they're more comfortable just having that autonomy with an elevated risk, as opposed to assimilating, being part of the state government, and in their minds not having a say in how they operate from an IT standpoint. So we see it in certain aspects within our state government where there's certain groups that are broken out, and then we also see it in the locals. And I was curious to hear if that's something that popped up as well.
So I think nothing direct to the idea of autonomy and wanting to maintain that autonomy, but given that there's variability among states and what they're doing their funding models, I think there is still that challenge of, hey, at a state level, we're providing these other resources, and then the challenges of, that might preclude or prevent smaller governments from taking advantage of those. So in one state, it might be that, the issue of autonomy. It might, in other states, well, we don't have the budgets to pay for that a la carte service that the state government wants to provide. So didn't hear anything specific to the autonomy, but I'm certain that would be a very valid point that we would find if we went and looked at every single state. Absolutely.
Robert?
Yeah, a couple and one observation, and I suspect this is the case in other states, but in Wisconsin, the state with other government, Brookfield is smaller than many governments, but I don't consider it a small government, like a town of 10,000 people that has one IT person. But and it isn't so much on the prevention, but it's more on the response. I mean, there's in effect, it's a critical response team where they have professionals from the state government and other local governments that are available if someone has a cybersecurity threat or incident that occurs. And I suspect that might, it's more cure than prevention, but hopefully, or mitigation after the fact. So I think those are out there. The question I had, Joe, was, and you highlighted from a couple of the surveys or whatever about, the barriers in terms of, funding or inability to find people in general. Was there any comparison or any insight that anybody shared? Are governments worse or better off than the private sector in that regard, given that all entities face these threats? But obviously we're focused on governments.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that we would have when we would talk to, one individual, and they go, well, I'm not competitive in hiring, right? And so I think say that private sector may have more access to individuals or more funding, probably makes for a reasonable case that's, a fair point, right? Just that what can be offered, and then the challenges in luring away. I mean, one of the individuals we talked about said, there's a lot of movement in cybersecurity staffing, and they're able to kind of have a lot of options at the moment, and so they know that they're at a premium. So
I am.
So I know in the state auditor's office, we had an IT team and we had such turnover and it was really hard to attract people. The question I have is that we would do a lot of IT audits at the state and we would contract for them too. And the IT department, they would push back on a lot of the findings and they would come back and say, well, we're just going to assume the risk instead of fixing this. And I was wondering if you saw any of that in all of this study. And by the way, I think the staff did an amazing job with this study and it was really interesting. But that was something that, I mean, we weren't happy about it because they weren't going to fix the things, but they were just going to assume that risk. And so I was wondering, did you see any of that or were you able to get into that at all?
I wouldn't say that anyone we've specifically talked about assuming risk, but I'll say two maybe relevant examples. The first being, I mentioned the MS Isaac does that survey of state and local governments, and they have that scale of 1 to 5, and 5 being kind of their minimum baseline. Well, and I'm forgetting the specific wording, but I know we referenced in the paper. There's kind of an alternative rating of 5, which is the government assessing. We looked at the risk and we're fine, right? Or we've looked at the risk and we don't determine that it's anything we need to do a bunch of processes and standards and controls around. You don't get a lot of insight into that. I'm sure it probably would be a sensitive thing to put out there. Here's a list of the governments that will just take on that risk. But talking with certain individuals, we did have, I can think of at least one conversation where I think we were hearing about one individual and that there's another entity that had suffered a cybersecurity incident and they had kind of been told, we've been telling you that things are coming. You got to get your system up to date. And they weren't making a very intentional, decision to assume that risk, but they weren't making intentional decisions in the opposite direction. So the perception kind of provided by that individual was that they had assumed that risk and then they saw an exposure due to that risk. So no one was offering up to us that they weren't doing it, but it's the fact that it's an option in the MS Isaac's annual report clearly says that it's an option that some governments take.
So, Jeff, I'm going to ask this because it builds a little bit off what Robert and Diane said. Robert talked about recovery, kind of an emphasis on recovery. And I almost wonder a little bit of what Diane, a possible explanation for responses like Diane might have received are an extension of the if not, it's not if, it's when, is we're going to get attacked and we're probably going to lose at some point. And so what we really want to focus on rather than the prevention is the recovery. And as long as we can recover and whatever that looks like, we're okay not focusing too much on the prevention. And in my discussions with users and different stakeholders, a lot of them seem to talk more about, I care almost more about the recovery than the prevention, because it doesn't really matter if I can recover quickly, it doesn't matter whether it happens or not. Did you get any sense of that, or how we could think about recovery and response rather than risk and threat?
It's a great question. I don't know if we got anyone who really split it into two, because I think sometimes when you talk about our recovery efforts, some of those recovery efforts, how extreme those recovery efforts could be, are going to be mitigated by how much that you've done some sort of prevention work. So, I don't think anything in a total binary, but I would agree though, when we talk about recovery, not to get ahead of ourselves when we get to objective 3, recovery definitely seems to be the area that we heard the most interest in, right? I mean, they want you to be preventing it, but they also want you to, if something happens, right, when, not if, they want to know that you're going to get back on your feet relatively quickly. But I think a lot of the even conversation we had where folks were indicating that a lot of the things that they said they kind of wanted to know about were still prevention items. They kind of were setting the groundwork for you to be able to get back up real quick. But yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I would say the focus or the real interest is on that recovery.
Thanks, Joe. Jeff, you had your hand up, took it down. Now Chris has his hand up.
Well, if Chris has a follow-up, he can go. Mine's a little bit
Okay.
off.
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, my follow-up was just that I think being in the middle of it, the most difficult piece was for us, just in our situation, wasn't the recovery as much as it was the understanding of what was impacted, right? And so imagine somebody comes into your home and 2 bedrooms, everything's disheveled and they flip everything over. You know they were in these bedrooms, and you can say everything in these bedrooms potentially is at risk of being shared. It might be gone, the jewelry, etc. But there are other rooms that look untouched, right? But they in accessing your system or in accessing, your infrastructure, they could have potentially been in there. How much and what they did and what they pulled out, you don't know. And so the difficulty for us as a government, when you have a responsibility and a statutory responsibility to report to the public, is how do you report to the public in a responsible way where you sound informed, where you don't cause a greater concern of the general public that, hey, these guys know what they're doing or they're on top of things, because you're really trying to figure out what was touched and what wasn't. And maybe some of those things, some of those bedrooms where things don't look touched and look undisturbed are the ones that have the most sensitive information. And so for us, it wasn't, I understand that there are other organizations where that recovery is really important depending on if they're locking down your system. But in our cases, it wasn't a locking down of the system. It was like a duplication of the system, of going in and accessing. So I guess my point is just that when you're in the middle of it, sometimes those detections, you go back and say, oh man, I wish we would have focused more on making sure the doors were double bolted, making sure that everything was locked down more securely in order to prevent somebody even getting in. Because now that somebody's in, we have egg on our faces because we can't intelligently explain what's going on until we really get into it for weeks and weeks and weeks, which causes the public and the news articles and everything just goes, out of hand.
Yeah, it's interesting, Chris, right? It's not this I want to say binary, not this categorizable, but what you're talking about is the loss of information, some of it reputational harm, some of it could be economic harm because you lost some private information for people or yourself or whoever, versus what's the impact on the operations of the government? Can it do its billing? Can it, are the traffic lights working? Is the E911 system running? Those are almost two separate things. And, they have different outcomes, maybe that could, or, without getting into objective 3, it may be information that users care about knowing, and they're both probably important, but you might think about them a little differently. And recovery helps more if you're worried about the operational aspects, but recovery isn't really as relevant in that situation you're describing. So it's interesting to kind of have to think about both those aspects. All right. Jeff, did you want to bring one up, or you're?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thanks. So I too, like my fellow board members, really appreciated the paper and got a lot out of it to think about. One of the things, taking sort of a step up, thinking about objective 1 from the point of view of, okay, we're doing this research for a particular purpose. And I sort of looked at objective 1 sort of like the way we would think about prevalence, right? Like, how prevalent is this in our environment? And my takeaway, Joe, which I wanted to confirm with you, is, you talked a lot about the external environment that governments face, and it seemed to me that the external environment that governments face is as intense as the external environment that lots of other entities face, right? But when we turn to the internal factors, those internal factors, like the nature of the services that governments provide, the their or attack surface, as you called it, which is my new fun term, attack surface, funding and staffing concerns that we know are the reality for a lot of governments, particularly small governments, legacy systems. Those internal factors seem to me to make the environment that governments face, in a sense, tougher than the environment that others face. Would you say that's from your research experience, would you say that that's an accurate takeaway from objective one?
I would say it's a reasonable takeaway that it's a tough environment. I don't know if we say that we have statistical data that would say it's this much tougher than a private sector organization. But I mean, a lot of the publications that we read highlighting all these challenges, and we have all these issues, and we have legacy IT systems, and we have things where, well, okay, now we need to get these staff that we can't seem to competitively get, that are kind of that first step for kind of turning that around. I think it's a reasonable position when we talk about, that it is quite a bit of a challenge. There's a lot of professional organizations talking about it, specifically, groups that are focused on certain types of governments that are putting out publications about cybersecurity because of challenges those governments are facing, right? We'll talk about some other ones when we get to objective 3, like cybersecurity insurance can be a challenge, some other aspects, because of some of the things you need to have it that are a little bit tougher for governments to have in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I'm holding back from some of the things that we'll talk about in objective 3, right? I'm just sort of saying, as an environment, right? Like, it seems to me that governments have a tough environment, right? That prevalence of this issue is pretty high for them. So now we got to talk about objectives 2 and 3 and see, like, okay, what do you do given that you're dealing with that environment?
Yeah.
Thanks, Jeff. Any other questions or comments on objective 1 for the team from the board? All right. Thanks, Joe.
All right.
Keep going.
Let's talk about objective 2. That was to determine whether and how cybersecurity is disclosed in financial statements. As I mentioned earlier, we looked at financial statements of 2 mutually exclusive samples of governments. Sample 1 being governments that have been the victims of publicized cybersecurity incidents, right? Things that were getting reported in the news. And sample 2 being of governments that, as far as we could tell, had not, right? And to get at what are you disclosing when you have a cybersecurity incident? What are you disclosing when maybe it's not as front of mind for you because you haven't had such an incident? And we found that some state and local governments voluntarily provide information about cybersecurity in their financial statements. And that, I would say this information was generally limited to information about cybersecurity incidents and cybersecurity insurance. Those were the 2 most common things we saw. But, in some other items we saw, some information we observed was also likely provided in accordance with existing guidance for broader topics, right? So, for example, contingencies, as I mentioned earlier, data breaches can result in litigation from individuals that had their data leaked. And so we have contingency guidance. So they're talking about maybe a lawsuit, arising from a data breach or something that we saw. We had relatively similar observations from both samples. I think, as you'd see in the paper, there were a few more instances for sample 1, which, we believe is primarily due to those governments having incidents to talk about, which sample 1 presumably does not have. And we also noted that for both samples, that the location of where cybersecurity was talked about within a government's financial statements varied. Most commonly was observed in notes to financial statements, and then with discussions in the MD&A being a close second. But we also observed references in letters of transmittal and also in RSI or OSI. And specifically with regards to note disclosures, we also observed variability with respect to the type of note disclosure in which that information was provided. Most commonly, it was in disclosures related to risk management, contingencies, and public risk pools. But we did observe a limited number of disclosures that were specifically labeled as cybersecurity note disclosures. And typically that would be, a government had an incident and they were talking about that incident. We also observed variability in the level of detail with which cybersecurity was provided. For cybersecurity incidents, some governments only made a brief general reference to the incident, while others sometimes describe the impact, I guess, a little bit more directly. For cybersecurity insurance, some governments provided specific amounts of cybersecurity coverage or recoveries, while others simply referenced that they had that coverage, sometimes in a broader list of different types of insurance coverages. Of note, we found in our sample that the quantified impact of cybersecurity incidents generally appears to be relatively smaller in magnitude. This is reflected in the majority of incidents for governments in the first sample for which that data was available. We compared the total cost of the incident when it was available in the financial statements or, as reported in the news, to a government's annual expenses, which we had used to get a proxy for the size of the government, for the purpose of assessing the relative magnitude of those incidents when compared to those governments. So outside of a single outlier, the majority of the costs of these incidents were below 1% of a government's annual expenses, with a couple being just over 1%. And I would note, the level of relative magnitude observed in our sample is also something we saw reflected in other academic studies that we reviewed as a part of our literature review. But I'd be remiss, though, if I didn't know, we completely acknowledge there is absolutely potential for a larger, much more significant disaster level type of cybersecurity incident. So the intent here with talking about smaller magnitude is not to downplay the effects of cybersecurity incidents broadly, but just, as we'll discuss in Objective 3, determining the significance of cybersecurity incidents for the purpose of financial reporting may present, some challenges. In addition to reviews of financial statements in these samples, when we met with the board last July to provide a progress update, we were also asked to take a look at what types of information about cybersecurity that governments might be providing in the official statements of their bond offerings. And I will say it was a great suggestion because it really complemented information that we had obtained from discussions with stakeholders for the municipal bond rating industry. And in doing so, we found that, some state and local governments voluntarily do provide information about cybersecurity and other documents, such as these official statements of their bond offerings. And so for this item, I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful PTA, Eniola, to discuss that section of our research.
Thank you, Joe. The sample for our review of official bond offering statements began with the 111 distinct governments across samples 1 and 2. For this analysis, we determined through a review on the MSRB's EMA website whether those governments had issued bonds between January 2023 and September 2025. Of those 111 governments, we observed that 50 had issued bonds within our specified period, and a review of the most recent official statements available for those 50 governments identified that 42 had provided information about cybersecurity within those documents. The cybersecurity disclosures we observed varied in length and level of detail about certain aspects of cybersecurity, such as higher level information about cybersecurity posture and recent cybersecurity incidents. We note that generally, more detailed cybersecurity disclosures tended to come from larger governments, especially when such disclosures included information about a widely publicized cybersecurity incident. More broadly, cybersecurity disclosures we observed in these documents typically tended to be general enough in nature that such language often could be provided by other governments with similar circumstances. That is, that the government has information technology systems and as such is therefore exposed to cybersecurity risks. Additionally, that the government provides no assurance that it is fully protected from future cybersecurity incidents, or that a future cybersecurity incident will not have a material adverse effect on its financial position, which the project staff notes plays into that notion of the when, not if, aspect that many stakeholders we interviewed used to describe the potential for future cybersecurity incidents. We also spoke with professionals from the municipal bond industry. They indicated that they often gather additional information about cybersecurity directly from governments, in addition to the information those governments provide in their official statements. While they indicated that they find information about cybersecurity useful for their analysis, they also acknowledged the sensitivity of such information and that some of the more sensitive information they seek directly from governments, such as more specific information related to their cybersecurity posture, has potential to result in disclosure conflicts if made publicly available. I'll now hand it over back to Joe.
Thank you, Eniola. And so in addition to official statements, I would note, we also, we search for any continuing disclosures that governments in our samples may have reported on any bonds they had to the MSRB's EMMA platform. We saw a very limited amount of those. We also looked at data breach notifications that may have been provided to affected individuals by governments that had suffered a data breach. And I would say for the most part, when we looked at those, typically the information there was a little limited in detail for what we do for here. I mean, nothing above what we saw in other examples. So that kind of gets us to the end of objective 2, when we looked at what are governments providing out there already. And then, specifically also with that additional takeaway that we learned regarding the general potential relative magnitude of some of those incidents, at least within our sample. So I think it'd be a good point here to pause again and see if the board has any comments, questions, or feedback for us regarding objective 2.
Thanks, Joe and Eniola. Board member questions or comments on objective 2 for the team? Diane.
Joe, one of the things that I found interesting was how the reporting was done. And it didn't seem like there was any real consistency. I mean, some of the things, they would all fall in the same column, but it seemed like the reporting was kind of haphazard as far as, however the government felt like reporting it and where they would report. Do you see possibly a path forward as far as like even prescribing like how they would report certain things, or is there anything like to make it a little more consistent so it's easier to find, especially since this is an area that's going to probably be growing in the future instead of reducing the impact?
Yeah, I'll say, I think, when we talk about information informing cybersecurity risks, I don't want to get too ahead of myself for objective 3, but I think it depends on certain items that we think may have potential and how to those, as far as where to consistently apply some of the items that governments voluntarily provided. I would say one of the more common, I think, unique ones, right? Talking outside of risk pool, because, for example, ones we might have seen about risk pools, we're giving it in guidance of risk pools, and ones we might have seen about contingencies, we're using contingency guidance. I think the ones that, chose to provide a cybersecurity incident disclosure, I mean, they're doing that apropos of a requirement. So, I guess we would have to look at, I mean, that would be something that I think a future project would have to do as far as if we were to go that route, as far as setting up kind of how you would be reporting that information or consolidating it. But I would agree. I mean, the takeaway being that it's here or it's a little bit there. It sneaks in where the government thought it might be relevant, certain cases, right? And certain, as I mentioned, sometimes with insurance, they're giving us some, okay, we have this much insurance. This is our policy. This is what it covers. Sometimes we have flood insurance, we have fire insurance, and we have cybersecurity insurance, and we have, and so it's not a ton. So they're kind of putting it there because that's the relevant place for them to put it. But I would agree, it would be something we would, to move forward, we'd have to look at.
Other board members? Jackie.
For those that actually put information in their financial statements on the cost of the incident, do you have any feel for how they manage to capture those costs? I'm kind of thinking they're not all just in one line item of expenses in their chart of accounts. How did they feel comfortable that they were actually pulling the total cost that it was? Were they not as concerned about capturing the full cost as just having some information that was out there? Did they feel that these were the only costs, or that there were going to be additional costs that they're going to continue to incur down the road? Because I'm kind of thinking that this is something that I'm going to use Chris's idea that there might have been something in that other bedroom that they didn't pull forward when they were kind of figuring out what the costs were, because they didn't actually know that was something that they needed to capture at that time. So I was just wondering how comfortable they were feeling with the information they were reporting.
So I would say, at least takeaway from the governments we saw that provided it. Well, let me talk about two examples, right? We saw a lot of cost information in the news, and you kind of see a big aggregate number, and that might be recovery costs, and that also might be IT upgrade costs, and kind of we had to get back to where we were, and now we need to make sure we kind of prevent it from happening in the future. For the ones where we saw it really quantified, I think it's, if I were to paraphrase it, probably ones that were easier to quantify, right? We're talking about, I think one of the examples we provided in the paper, the government's talking specifically about amounts of money that were stolen through a cyber attack. And so they're saying we lost this much money, this much was taken over this many days. But even then, it's even in that example where they provided a relatively, sizable incident disclosure, they're kind of talking about, your point, maybe one aspect of it, right? They're talking about how much was stolen, and you would assume that they would do some work to, I mean, granted, to Diane's earlier question, could they assume the risk? And sure they could, but usually when you see people talking about, we had an incident and now we're working on updating our systems, even that example, not really quantifying the path forward. They're really just kind of telling you a certain piece of it. And for them, it might be the piece of that incident that was more material. But, so nothing, I would say, where we got really maybe fully comprehensive costs all the way around. But also with these, a lot of times you hear a large number, either in the news or in the financial statements, and that could be inclusive of quite a bit of things. And I think that is one of the, we'll come back to that when we get to Objective 3. I think one of the challenges is we started thinking about potential.
Yeah, because if you stop to think about the scramble that they do when they've had an incident, right? They got a lot of staff that are going to be looking at that. I'm thinking those costs are costs that they've incurred too, because they're diverting staff from their other responsibilities to take this on. And you don't know how long or how much that's happened, but I can imagine that it would well tie up staff for a considerable amount of time.
I'd agree.
Chris.
I think Jackie's dead on. That's something that I didn't really think about at the time. I thought about it from a resource and that the staff could be doing other things that are really important operationally, but not really the cost that's related to this incident. But one of the things that we really struggled with was how much is too much. So going back to that example that you and I used, Jackie, yeah, I'll put the floodlights on, but do I do the Ring doorbells on every door? And then do I put on every single window the sensors, and do I have a camera in every room? And it's the same thing from an IT perspective, because like the team mentioned in the paper, and like we've been talking about, or Jeff mentioned, governments are a little behind in their overall security measures, their investments in technology, et cetera. And so what we end up with is, wow, there is a lot to do. What do we focus on? And ultimately, what we had to do was come up with a list of, through some third parties to say, hey, these are the 12 things that I would focus on, and here's the relative impact. And then you measure that also against the political risk, right? And everything else you're dealing with to try to figure out what those things are. So that dollar amount, one, it might be a big one if you were to do everything, but much like deferred maintenance, like you're never going to do everything, right? You're only going to do a portion of it. And what's that portion that you're going to do? And then what's that portion that you're going to do in the current year? Because there were things that we said, all right, we'll put this in the budget for next year. We'll think about this next year. And maybe it gets approved, maybe it doesn't. But for right now, we have to focus on these things with this limited amount of money that we have and some other funds that may have been diverted over to help. You start thinking about things like re-imaging every single computer and every printer. That's not really infrastructure, put up a wall, but it's the cleanup that's necessary when someone has ransacked your house, right? And that's another cost that gets to be fairly expensive that maybe you don't necessarily think of, but it adds to that big number that you're talking about.
Chris, Robert.
Well, kind of continuing the theme a little bit from what Jackie and Chris are saying. I mean, just anecdotally on that cost of the response event. I mean, we had a relatively minor data breach issue about 2.5 years ago, and the out-of-pocket costs were 20 to 40,000 probably, which is not significant. But the cost of my time, our IT staff's time, in terms of diversion from other activities was significant. And then there's probably lingering things that, from a, certain training, certain other, further enhancements to, because it started with an email compromise. Somebody put a password in something that they thought was, a legitimate system, and it wasn't. So I think I think it would be difficult. It's going to be difficult to identify that. But then even if you do, what's the relevance? Okay, so it cost a lot of money to address and mitigate the issue. Yeah, we know that, but I go back to that the percentages of total budget that Joe referenced. I'm going, it's just not that significant. The second comment, and I think we'll talk about this more in Objective 3, but I found it interesting, not relative to the notes, but relative to the official statements and related, that the bond raters, or at least the ones that you talk to, seem to indicate that they got more use out of individual interaction with issuers than official statement disclosure, which, okay, they have you got to talk to the bond rating agency, if you want a rating. Not everyone talks to investors or analysts. I mean, maybe larger entities do on a more regular basis, but the vast majority probably don't. And so there's a playing field issue potentially here, in that the bond raters might have more information, and they're using that in assessing, as part of their rating analysis. But other users might not necessarily have that. So we can talk about that more. Really, it's probably more Objective 3, but.
Carolyn.
Just to add on to, really not to add on, but my thoughts were very similar to what Robert had just brought up. If you're in the in the know and you have the resources, you can get a lot more information than what the general public can get, and that is, how can that playing field be leveled, was one of the things that I kept coming away with. I used to work for a very publicly scrutinized organization. So every meeting that we had, whether it was a full board meeting or a committee meeting, was always publicized and had reporters there. So the information was easily available. But if you're not under that type of spotlight, how do you get this type of information, that there has been a security incident and what the organization is doing to recover and to protect your information? So not really a question, but just, an observation that I just kept coming back to.
Thanks, Carolyn. Yeah, I have an observation, Jeff, that builds on Robert and Carolyn, and is probably not really a question, Joe, as much as an observation, that it kind of started with me. The materiality part of it, I think, maybe surprised me a little bit. Maybe if I really step back and think about it, maybe it shouldn't. Some of the cost, I don't want to say concern, the problems with determining what the costs are to include in a number is probably part of what's keeping it maybe not as material as maybe I would have thought. But nevertheless, it seems really material. And that strikes me as a little odd given it was the highest rated kind of prioritization for us by the GASAC. And so why would the GASAC members on the whole be worried about something that just isn't, almost in all cases, not material? And it kind of led me down a thinking of there's a reputational risk, which the paper talks about, that's really kind of part of the big deal, and nobody wants that reputational risk. But is the financial report able to deal with any of that? You know, I guess those are things to think about. And then beyond the reputational risk, it's the potential to be that one or two that's really bad. And you don't want to be the one or two that are really bad and become material. And so, like, the languages in the official statements that I saw and the paper has indicated that, you know, that information tends to be more educational in nature. In my experience, it's almost more, hey, this risk exists and we didn't want to not disclose it to you, even though what we disclose as the risk is the same thing everybody else that discloses it says. There's nothing unique here, or that probably a user didn't know, but some attorney said, you know about this risk, you can't not disclose it, but I'm not going to tell you anything about it, which then leads to, well, how do you get the information that they care about? And that's the conversation that Carolyn and Robert were ending with, was, well, who has access to be able to have those conversations? But to build on what both Robert and Carolyn said about even playing field, which I recognize and acknowledge, I also recognize that in talking to any of those people, which I think the paper says, and is my experience in talking to those people as well, they go, yeah, but the only reason they talked to me was they knew it wasn't going to be any public disclosure, that it was a confidential conversation. And so there's a balance of, yeah, we want an even playing field, but at the same time, the only reason they got that information was because it could be confidential and wasn't publicly available. And so that's all things we're going to have to kind of think about. Jeff.
Okay, so Joel, you stole a little my thunder, but
Sorry.
that's okay. That's okay. So when I thought about objective 2, I was thinking about it from the point of view, I guess we haven't used the term yet, Joe, right? But the term you use in the paper, this cybersecurity disclosure conflict, right? The idea that what could you say that wouldn't put a bullseye on your back, right? And I was really interested to look at what we found here to see, like, okay, what are governments willing to say in this environment? And I did note, the research showed that it seems like victims were twice as likely to disclose as non-victims in our samples. And that made sense to me, right? Like, if there's some imperative that something's happened to me and now I got to say something. There were some disclosures, and I don't want to read too much into it because I know, Joe, you'll say it's not a sample, it's a large enough sample, but there was some willingness among non-victims to disclose information. Their disclosures seem to be, you said, more generic, but they seem to be some willingness to disclose insurance information, which I found surprising because I would think that's the type of information that if were I to disclose that I have insurance, that would maybe set some people interested in me, right? But then I came down to, like what Joel was talking about, looking at these like sample disclosures you excerpted from the official statements, right? And saying, okay, so what are they really willing to say? And I know we'll talk about this more, right? But I was not deriving a whole lot from that information, right? And so I was sort of still then in the place like, well, yeah, it seems like governments, we can't confuse a willingness to say something with a willingness to say something valuable, right? And so that's going to be our struggle. And last point I'll make is, I guess we'll say that in here, Joe, you talked to, and I'm glad you did this, you went and looked at the EMA filings for those victims, right? And only 3 of them did EMA filings, right? Now, I don't want to read too much into that, but I could take away that this is just bolstering this materiality discussion. Presumably, if they thought it was material, they would be more likely to file something. But the fact that they had this thing and they didn't view it as material, that they were comfortable not to file anything, right? Would you say that's a right view to take?
Yeah, no, I would agree that, I mean, we didn't find many of those. And I'll give 2 examples from ones that we looked at. One was not necessarily what I would say a cybersecurity notice. It was an event notice about a cancellation of a bond, and then the subtext was because of a cyber attack, right? So they were really talking about the cancellation of a bond, which for them was very material. The little bit of extra context was that it was because of a cybersecurity incident. And the other one of the other ones we saw, they talked about, okay, we had an incident. They didn't really give too much details, but the final line of it was something along the lines of, and it's all good. We've taken care of it, it's resolved, and we're fine now. And so even, you look at that and go, okay, I can see maybe why you felt the need to, but also then from a financial reporting aspect, it is saying, hey, we had an incident and we totally took care of it. Is that something that would, like you said, rise to the level of something you would want to see?
Yeah. I mean, I think we've heard, at least I've heard from some places that they talk about the idea that, or a view that I want to know that the government's been attacked because, and that, catastrophe didn't happen, right? Because the more of the times I hear that the government has endured something, the more comfortable I'll be that the government can endure other things which will inexorably come in the future, right? So even though this particular event or whatever was not that significant, there is a view among some that I would like to know about it, because that allows me to say, yeah, these guys can withstand a lot, right? And they're dealing with this, and they know how to come back from it, right? So that's going to be, I think, one of the things we're going to have to view, like, battle with how to think about that.
Jeff, I've thought a lot about that last point too, and I'm not sure what I think about it, but it is certainly something we're gonna have to battle with. All right, anything else, comments or questions about objective 2 from anybody? All right, Joe, on to
right.
objective 3.
Home stretch, on to the fun one. Objective 3, to determine whether financial reporting guidance has the potential to address user needs for this information. Users' financial statements who participated in our research were generally interested in information about cybersecurity risks. Again, no surprise, as you brought up, this was highly prioritized by the GASB in April 2024 and in March 2025. And it seems that, at least, for the folks that we talked with, a lot of this interest stems from their awareness of cybersecurity risks. And for the majority of them who discussed the potential of future cybersecurity incidents in terms of when, not if, that interest appears to primarily lie in a government's ability to withstand and respond to those risks in the future, right? Not to say that they don't care about a current incident that's currently happening or just wrapped up, but it's really more about, their ability to respond in the future. And so we found that users acknowledge that disclosures related to cybersecurity information could increase the government's exposure to cybersecurity risks, and that some may be inclined to temper their request for this information to be included in the government's financial reports. And in some cases, users identified alternative methods for obtaining information about a government's cybersecurity posture. For example, when we talked with the GASB, when the staff met with them at the March 2025 meeting, the top item of feedback we received was concern about the potential for a cybersecurity disclosure conflict, right? That information could put a target on a government's back or make it easier to make that government a victim. And so some of the users we spoke with, acknowledging the sensitivity, noted that they obtain more detailed information directly from governments when able to do so, and what we were just talking about here. And that others also rely on general information, maybe not specific to an individual government, but to the government sector more broadly, such as the MSI6 annual cybersecurity reviews, trying to get a, kind of a weather gauge. As we got into objective 3, looking for areas of potential, we first returned to the GASB's literature. As I mentioned, you'll only find a singular reference to cyber risks in the basis for conclusions statement 102, which is to note that they are outside the scope of that standard. But to narrow down areas of potential, we wanted to get an understanding of the different areas for where there may already be some relevant guidance for certain outcomes related to cybersecurity. And we found that there is some existing financial guidance that would be applicable generally to certain aspects and outcomes of cybersecurity incidents. For example, if a government's IT hardware is damaged in an incident, we have impairment guidance. If a government is subject to litigation from a data breach, there's contingency guidance. If a government receives proceeds from cybersecurity insurance, there's guidance for insurance recoveries. I won't go through all those for the sake of time here, but it's just to say at the end of the day, based on the items we looked at in existing literature, and then in the context of feedback we heard from users and potential examples we observed in the financial statements and official statements, we believe it kind of leaves us with three potential areas for topics for financial reporting related to cybersecurity, and that'd be cybersecurity posture, cybersecurity insurance, and cybersecurity incidents. And so I guess, that first one, posture, right? Kind of what is your control environment, basically. The primary thing we heard from users is that they are looking for indications that a government is being proactive in assessing and addressing exposure to cybersecurity risks, that it has a higher maturity cybersecurity posture, that it's able to recover from cybersecurity incidents. Some items we heard about related to posture include risk management processes, their ability to identify and address cyber risks, governance and oversight of cybersecurity efforts, funding of cybersecurity initiatives, use of specific cybersecurity frameworks or guidance, policies and procedures in place of an incident, and then also assessments of the government's cybersecurity capabilities. This is kind of, when you say, hey, take disclosure conflict off the table, what would you really want, right? But we know that while that information might be potentially useful to some users, we also note a couple of considerations or challenges that we want to have in mind in the context of financial reporting. First is a bit of a challenge in finding that middle ground between high-level language that some users might find boilerplate and detailed language that some governments would be concerned might result in disclosure conflicts, and where that line is kind of varies depending on who you're talking to. Some cybersecurity stakeholders we talked to also expressed a concern that boilerplate language has the potential to be harmful through misinterpretation without additional education of the individuals using it. We also noted that many states have identified varying items of information about cybersecurity as confidential and have therefore passed legislation exempting that information from open public records requests. And there are, I would say, potential implications for a government that would not disclose something if a disclosure requirement existed, right? Noting that we typically not require a negative disclosure. It's possible that a government with a limited cybersecurity posture would disclose nothing if required, and that the absence of such a disclosure could be indirectly interpreted as them being an easy target. So even having disclosure, disclosing nothing for some governments could create an indirect disclosure conflict. And the last item I would note for posture is that, cybersecurity posture is generally a control environment related topic for which we don't really have an analogous requirement. And while cybersecurity risks are very front of mind in the current environment, I would say, I'll acknowledge we did struggle a little bit to identify justification or rationale for elevating cybersecurity controls above other controls that might be used to mitigate other types of risks to which some governments might have a higher exposure. The second item in that list of potential items would be cybersecurity insurance. It's a tool that some governments use within their cybersecurity posture. And so you might say, well, isn't that kind of in the last group? And I would note, we discussed it separately in the paper for two main reasons. It was the second most common type of information we observed governments providing. And some stakeholders we interviewed brought up some very specific points about insurance. And there were really two main items that we also heard about the usefulness of that information about cyber insurance. Is first being that it provides some comfort that the potential financial effect of a future incident might be somewhat mitigated. But then there were also some that indicated that the government having cybersecurity insurance could be another way of, kind of interpreting that they might have a higher cybersecurity, higher maturity for their cyber posture. But while that information might be useful to users, we also know some concerns that were brought to our attention about cybersecurity insurance. Premiums are rising, providers are adding a lot of technical requirements to even maintain, let alone obtain policies. And policies are getting increasingly riddled with exclusions and limits and certain outs, right? For example, if something was an act of war, and the insurance company is going to say, that's not on us. And so all this is to say, it's getting increasingly difficult to obtain comprehensive coverage. And so then specific to financial reporting, there's a concern that some users might view higher level information about a government's cybersecurity insurance coverage as providing more comfort than it actually does, right? But then there's a concern also, again, that providing too much information about your cybersecurity insurance could also create a disclosure conflict. Some stakeholders noted that a government providing their insurance coverage amount could really enable a threat actor to better calculate a more acceptable, digestible ransom amount. I have $3 million of coverage. Well, I want a $2.9 million ransom payment. Okay, we have policy, right? And so, finding that middle ground between some of those points with regards to disclosure conflict can be challenging. Again, state legislation exempting information from open public records requests. I'll say we identified a few states where they specifically exempt information about cybersecurity insurance as confidential, and so wouldn't be released to the, through open public record requests made by the public. And then lastly, cybersecurity insurance, it kind of what we saw examples in some of the note disclosures we saw some governments provide. It's just one type of insurance. And so again, while cybersecurity is a bit front of mind, we did, again, struggle a little bit to find a justification or rationale for elevating cybersecurity insurance above other types of insurance coverages. The last item, cybersecurity incident, users we interviewed, they expressed an interest for information about the operational effects of cybersecurity incidents. They told us they find it challenging sometimes to get information about these incidents. But they said, really when it's the smaller, less disruptive ones that they want to know about, that might be less likely to be reported in the news. Kind of to Jeff's point earlier, even examples of when, hey, we had one and we defeated it. Well, they're not maybe finding out about that information as commonly. And while smaller, less disruptive incidents might not have a potential level of significance for financial reporting, those users noted they still find information about incidents useful, really primarily for understanding the effectiveness of a government's overall cybersecurity posture. So some examples of information people said that they would be interested in about incidents be the date of the incident and its discovery, the type of incident that occurred, grants, advance, negotiations, payments, or other items of theft, what services were disrupted, or cost and outcomes of risk mitigation strategies and recovery efforts. And so while all this might be potentially useful to users, again, I guess a couple of considerations for the board to be considering, some potential challenges in the context of financial reporting. First is a matter of timeliness, right? In the context of qualitative characteristics of financial reporting, other current and proposed requirements we reviewed about cybersecurity incident disclosures, such as the SEC's 2023 rules, the CIS's proposed CERSA rules, they require an entity to report on those incidents within a couple of days. Given the reporting time lag in the governmental environment, it's possible that users of government financial statements wouldn't obtain information about a cybersecurity incident in those statements if required for over a year after that incident occurred. And then noting that users indicated they would use information about a cybersecurity incident to inform an assessment of a government's posture, and then it's likely that a government might have addressed its posture following an incident. I guess say there's a question about whether the passage of time might diminish the usefulness of information about a cybersecurity incident, at least without providing additional information about changes to the government's posture that has happened since the incident, which just kind of gets us back to the discussion of posture. Similarly, disclosure conflicts are also a topic that was brought up here, finding that line between boilerplate language and giving away the farm. And so Similarly, also open public records exemptions. Maybe not something, we did see a handful, times where they would talk about incident, but I would note open public record exemptions. Sometimes you more see some broader language about if releasing that information could jeopardize security systems. And so it would be a matter of how those Open Public Records Act exemptions be interpreted by preparers who are determining whether that they can provide stuff here. But there's also terminology issues. We talked about, cybersecurity incident. It's a term that's already used extensively in practice, not always consistently. So there's potential that we would have to develop an authoritative definition to help preparers. And developing such guidance would also likely necessitate determining whether to narrow the scope of guidance to cyber-dependent incidents or more broadly to include cyber-enabled incidents, right? If you were to only do cyber-dependent incidents, you likely have to develop an authoritative definition of what cyber-dependent incident is, because it can vary in practice. But if you were to include cyber-enabled incidents, it's likely that that would be inclusive of many forms of traditional fraud, but only when carried out through technological means. As we talked a lot about in Objective 2, there's some potential challenges in clarifying what makes a cybersecurity incident significant for reporting. And, I guess I would say also some other, just a last note, again, kind of some considerations related to scope. I already mentioned cyber-enabled versus cyber-dependent, but I know that, a cybersecurity stakeholder indicated that the point for them where the incident really becomes a complex issue for its government is when it achieves a state of emergency declaration, at which point it's addressed on a larger scale as a type of disaster. And so again, while cybersecurity risks are very front of mind, we also kind of put us in a headspace where we're thinking through that one and struggle a little bit to identify a justification rationale, maybe for identifying a cybersecurity incident above other types of large scale events such as disasters that may be more relevant or material to some governments. So anyway, I know that's quite a bit there. That's it. We did a lot of thinking around areas of potential, trying to whittle it down, and then some of the potential challenges that would be there regarding to posture, insurance, and incident. So I guess now would be a good time to turn it back over to the board if you guys have any questions about Objective 3.
Thanks, Joe. Any board member comments or questions here? Diane.
Joe, I do have to comment that this was really balanced. It seems like, well, we could do this, but on the other hand, we get this. And I would just add that when we would do IT audits, everything was kept confidential, except the only ones that ever were released to the public would have to do with like governance policies, something that was just so generic that most people didn't even care about. So that's the only kind of information we would release. But I thought this was really well balanced, but it didn't leave me with anything where it's like, oh, let's go after that. Because there's always there's that counterbalance that, oh yeah, but this could happen. So I just wanted to make that comment.
Thanks, Diane. Jeff.
Just a quick thing following up on Diane's, which I have some other thoughts, but just a quick question for you, Joe, because I found interesting, you excerpted on page 60 of the paper this research that I guess was done about the SEC disclosures and how at least this researcher determined that it sounded like it was along the lines of the boilerplate stuff that Diane was talking about, but it sounds like from the research that was conducted, they determined that number one, it wasn't boilerplate, and number two, it didn't create this cybersecurity disclosure conflict, right? That we've been talking about. I was just wondering if you had any other thoughts about that research. Was that a common thing, or is that, I'm kind of interested in that result.
Well, I will say two things on that. I'm going to turn it over to Tammy because she and I had a lot of discussion on this one, kind of how they had structured it, but also the intent of you having that one there is also because it was one that was looked at quite a bit as the SEC was developing their 2023 rules. So it's definitely one we wanted to make sure you have. But I think specific to some of how they had set it up, I'm going to turn it over to Tammy here for a minute.
Oh, I love a good chance to talk about an academic paper. Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Jeff, for teeing up the question. I thought that this was probably the one that was most spot on if we're thinking about what Joe's been talking about making sure that the way that the board is thinking about this thinks about the disclosure conflict issue of what the disclosure does and ensuring that it doesn't introduce more harm. So I'll point out in that study that they looked at risk disclosures in a time period over a series of years and looked to see whether that was associated with future incidents in the next year. And so you can look at that, and I know we're looking at it like the disclosures, are those associated with a future incident, and is there some concern with that? This paper was focused on if those disclosures are capturing, those risk disclosures are capturing the risk of the entity, then we would expect an increase in incidents in the next period. And that is indeed what they found. And Jeff, the part that you're pointing out is the part where they said, okay, well, was the guidance that the SEC issued in 2011, what did that do to that effect, that relationship between the disclosures and the higher incidents? And what they found was that at the time period of the guidance, that negated, took entirely away the relationship between those risk disclosures and incidents. And so you can interpret that a couple of ways. You can say, one, the guidance didn't introduce any more harm. And you can also look at it like it also introduced a lot of disclosures that mitigated what you would expect to see, that the disclosures should be associated. If they're conveying risk, then they should be associated with higher incidents. And so you can see it in the post period sort of negating some of that relationship that you would expect to see between the risk and a subsequent incident. And then they did, and let me just point out too, they did a couple of things afterwards. They did look at some cool things about the uniqueness of the disclosures to show that didn't have an impact in the subsequent period on incidents. But as far as the guidance goes, the guidance didn't introduce any more harm, but it might have muddied the relationship between the risk and the incident.
And thank you for that, Tammy. And am I right to understand? Because part of what the two things you talked about seem to be a little conflicting, right? Is the way I'm taking it. But could it be that by the introduction of these rules, and I have to make a disclosure about them, that I'm going to do things that are going to lessen my risk profile because I don't want to put out a lousy disclosure, right? And so by doing that, maybe I actually lessen my risk. Is that what you were? Because I was a little unclear about, because it seemed to be your second point should have negated the first. You should have seen a heightened risk. If I'm explaining to you what my risks are, you would expect to see more attacks, right? But you're saying, no, that's not what we found, right? And so maybe it's via the disclosure mechanism itself, helping their cyber posture, right? That actually was the thing that prevented the future attacks.
It's not so much about the prevention of the attacks, it's about the relationship between the risk disclosures and the subsequent incidents. That's the part that with the introduction of the SEC guidance, that's the relationship that you see mitigated in the post period, that relationship is negated. So not so much that that they were able, and that, I mean, certainly what you propose is plausible, that they do some things to prevent that, but that's not what was really being modeled here. It was more, does the guidance do anything to the relationship, not to the incidents, but to the relationship between the risk disclosures and the incidents in the subsequent period?
So Tammy, can I say that a different way? Because they had the disclosure, because there was higher risk, it makes sense that they had more attacks. And so the disclosure didn't change the relationship.
I think that's probably mostly fair to say, if I'm interpreting what you're saying correctly. Yes,
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Jeff, you said I stole your thunder. That was an exact question I was going to ask too. So we're even. Chris.
My question was related to SOC 1 and SOC 2 reports. And if I know in Delaware, right, we talked a lot about what we disclose and like our infrastructure and things like that. And those are things that we do not disclose to the general public, even though we work with audit firms to get that work done. I was just curious to know if we've seen any correlation between those two things like that, the disclosures that we looked at, and how those governments tend to treat those reports. Because I would think that for the governments that right now do not disclose that type of information, they're going to be they're not going to be willing to disclose a lot in their financials if they are already not disclosing a lot from that internal control standpoint.
Yeah, I would say we did not see anyone in our review of financial statements disclosing anything close to a SOC 1 or SOC 2 type of information. You might have seen a time in schedule of expenditure of federal awards or something where there was something tied to a cybersecurity grant or maybe a minor finding, but nothing at the level of where it's really getting at, anything that you would see in a SOC 1 or SOC 2 report.
And Joe, I guess I'm asking, did we see or notice a correlation that for those that disclosed, they also were maybe a little bit more free with the circulation of the information that might be included in a SOC 1 or SOC 2, but for those that did not disclose, they also have a policy where they're not disclosing that other information to the general public?
I think that would be something we would have to look at as far as if there's a correlation about what they're sharing for other types of reports.
Okay, thank you.
As maybe a follow-up question, partly to Chris, but to Joe, I asked about these SOC reports as I talked to users and is this an avenue where you can get the information in a confidential way? And almost universally they said, I don't know what those are. I've never asked for one. I've never seen one. Is that consistent with either Chris, your experience? Was that all internal or did you provide it to things like rating agencies? Or Joe, did you hear any users talk about being able to have access or seeing those reports?
We did not. We kept it. Our IT department said, like, this is the holy grail. This is like if somebody gets this, it's the Trojan horse. They know everything about us, all of our weaknesses. We can't give it to anyone. And so it was completely confidential and kept in house in our state.
And I'll say we didn't hear from someone in the user community saying they look at that type of information, but I can say, we looked at, audit requirements that we saw from NASDAQ, where there are some states that have assessments specifically about cybersecurity systems pretty much on lockdown, or, just Open Public Records Acts where there are certain states where they have, assessments of capabilities or assessments of those types of items are kind of on that bullet list of things that they don't feel comfortable sharing. Sometimes they have the language that says until which point that it couldn't cause harm, it's confidential until we've mitigated the risk that we're trying to mitigate. The issue's been resolved, but no one brought up SOC 1 or SOC 2 specifically, but we did see instances, I think, on the other side, as far as considerations where assessments and other things like that would be potentially considered confidential by certain governments.
Thank you. Joe, I guess on this objective, I'd like to maybe echo what Diane said. There's a lot of good thought and information in this in the whole paper, but in particular in this part of the paper, and a lot of things for us to think about collectively as we consider how or if we move forward with anything here. Um, I, I just highlight a couple of things that really stood out to me, even though there's a lot of good things, and some of them you just mentioned again right then. But these legislative requirements to prohibit, disclosure in different forms seem to be relatively prevalent, at least in different, some more detailed than others. And I think in talking to you may actually be growing, like a trend is towards more of this, not less of this. That's as we consider, how consistently could this be applied, even if in a project we were to say, well, if you're prohibited from doing it, kind of like tax abatements, then don't do it. Well, then either we're going to encourage every state to have a policy like this so that nobody has to disclose anything, and then what's the point of our requirement? Or it's going to be inconsistent in certain states, and there'll be no disclosures in state X, Y, or Z, and then the other states. And so that part of it really creates kind of this weird, depending upon how we think about it, I guess, weird aspect that we'll have to consider moving forward. And the other that I kind of came back to a fair amount as I was thinking was, I guess cyber's more prevalent, so maybe that's what makes it different. But at some level, at what point is it different than other risks or internal control environment, responses do we want to see? Like as an auditor, we used to not give opinions, but be required to give reports on internal control over financial reporting. And isn't that even more relevant than this to the objectives of, is the information in this financial report correct? And yet that report often kind of isn't in an ACFR. It's often bound separately or whatever. And the financial statements themselves don't address that kind of risk. And then not even to speak of fraud or theft or other theft that isn't through cyber. There's just like, why is it this? And maybe it's just the prevalence and the growth of this that makes it more important. I don't know, but it is an interesting kind of where you draw the fence becomes difficult to think about. So.
Yeah, I would say, Joel, just real quick to your note, when we talk about open public record acts, the exemptions, right? They're, pretty much, I think we're able to find exemptions in about 48 out of the 50 states in some sort of language, and it varies. There are some states that it is very, very specific, where I can tell you, you can't talk about insurance. Full stop. I mean, certain states where governments can't even engage with threat actors, you just elevate it to the state's CISO's department and you're out of it. You can't even pay a ransom if you wanted to. But I think, and because you brought up the tax abatements one, I think one of the other challenges we saw is some of that language kind of, as I mentioned earlier, has that broader, if it could jeopardize, if it has the potential to jeopardize security or safety. And so there's times when maybe it's not as direct. And so as we're trying to narrow in on that and try to find, even more specific examples, it's how are those going to be interpreted by government, by preparers who are then trying to see whether or not they should provide this type of information. But then to your other point, there's a lot of legislation being passed about cybersecurity, so it's hard to tell you where those are going to be next year. But if I had to guess, they're going to move in the direction of the states that are more strict. But I mean, we've seen from the National Conference of State Legislatures, I mean, there were over 800 bills or resolutions last year alone tied to cybersecurity. Right. So anyway, it's a really good point. I just want to make sure brought up that, it's getting, I think, increasing attention in that arena.
Yeah, thanks for that additional context, Joe. Appreciate it. Jeff?
Yeah, so Joel, sort of building off of your comments, I had a couple of other sort of observations that sort of came through. One, I agree with you 100% about the confidentiality thing. I was like, boy, I got to understand more about that. And then your point about, as I struggle through each of the sections here, I'm like, boy, do we need to elevate this as it relates to cyber risk above the sort of similar thing that exists in other realms in which the government operates. Like, is cybersecurity insurance that much more important than other types of insurance that governments have, for example? And why would we do that? Sort of building upon that is this question, which we've sort of alluded to, about materiality, like how material are these things? And right, if and one of the struggles we're having is, I think it's more potential, right, or forward-looking fear that there could be a giant thing for somebody, but the reality has been that these things have not been giant, and so if we start to deal with that, and then I foresee a potential risk of an onslaught of disclosures of tiny little events, right, and like what would that serve? But my last point, and probably sort of most fundamental, and something I learned from the paper, right, is this: when the paper talked about, there's not even a universal definition of a cybersecurity incident, right? And if we're not, if we don't know, if the marketplace at large hasn't sort of settled on what that is, right? For us to think about what that is, because what are we looking at, right? If we're saying, what is your cybersecurity posture, or what is your cyber insurance? Well, what is it trying to cover? It's trying to help your prevent a cyber incident. Well, what's a cyber incident? Well, now we have to, and as the paper points out, there's a lot of things that are cyber enabled versus cyber dependent. And so that, to me, also is a pretty fundamental difficulty here that we would have to surmount when we're thinking about this going forward.
Thanks, Jeff. Any other comments or questions from the board on objective 3? Joe, do you have any, I guess, wrap up at this point, or was there anything else? We kind of covered the paper. You're on mute though, Joe.
You think by now I would know. I just want to say, thank you again, everyone. We really appreciate the comments and feedback today. It's going to be useful for us because we'll be coming back to you later this spring with the project prospectus to talk about cybersecurity. I just want to, kind of, as we wrap up this past year's effort, make sure we're, I thank all of those discussion participants that gave us their time and effort very generously, especially non-accountant cybersecurity individuals who were willing to talk very openly about some of their areas. And in addition to the wonderful team you saw with me today, I just want to thank two of our other, in addition to Eniola, two of our hardworking PTAs, Brent and Cameron, who were doing good work with us last year before their time with us ended. So we look forward to seeing you guys later this spring. We'll talk about a project prospectus.
And Joel or Alan or Joel, I think this is correct. The plan is to sort of share this with the GASAC. Is that right? So that, because we know we talked about a lot about how this is way up there on the GASAC's list of priorities, and trying to get more understanding about how they feel about what are potential standard setting activities that could be done. I think having them look at this information and then still seeing what they think about it could be a valuable bit of information for us.
I believe, and Alan can correct me, I believe the plan is to share this research with them as well as the project prospectus prior to the project prospectus then being deliberated by the board. So we would have their full kind of input on all of that prior to us then considering.
It was definitely more about providing them at GASAC with the project prospectus. To the extent we need to give them this report with it, we could. The product prospectus will have a summary of what's in this report. So I don't know if they need both, but they were going to get the prospectus, and I'm sure when Joe talks them through it, he would talk them through the report. But the prospectus was the main thing they would get at GASAC. Because that's really the question of do you think there's a project or not? So that's really the point of the prospectus.
True, but I think, as I'm thinking, for those willing to take a look at it, right? I think there's some real things to think about, rather than, if you're going to persist in thinking that there's some sort of project here that's going to be, how feasible you think the project is could be enlightened by how you look at the research memorandum.
Two things. I see. Number one, I think the research memo ends up on our website, so that's the first thing. But number two, to stick this report as an attachment to the prospectus. Okay, I don't think that's a problem. The report is done. It's ready. So, I mean, I don't have a lot of angst over that. So,
Anything else from anybody? All right. Well, thanks again, Joe and team. Appreciate all the work. Look forward to continuing the discussion and hearing what the GASAC has to say.
Thank you.
All right. It is 11:40 Eastern time. We at least need a break, and by the time we take a break, it's essentially kind of lunchtime. So I would kind of hate to start RER at that point. So I would say let's just break for lunch. Knock on wood, we're doing pretty good on time. We only had the RER discussion for the afternoon. So maybe let's come back at 12:45 Eastern time. So a little over an hour for lunch. And then I think that seems like a good starting time. I'm seeing nodding heads yes. So that sounds good to everybody. We will plan for that. See you all at 12:45. All right, welcome back. Alan's not on, but I know he's wrapping something up. I know he'll be on in just a second. So hope everybody had a good lunch. And we have one topic left for this board meeting, which is our revenue and expense recognition project. And Pam, I'll turn it to you first to get us going.
All right. Thank you, Joel. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you may be. We have two papers for the board today. And so let's just get it started. Kara will be presenting paper one. So I'll hand it over to Kara.
Thank you, Pam. Good afternoon, everybody. At the board's March 2025 meeting, the board began deliberations on the measurement component of this project. And part of that meeting did include a discussion about the allocation of consideration. But at that time, the board did not make any tentative decisions related to that topic. So since that meeting, the board has made tentative decisions regarding measurement for components of consideration included in the binding arrangement. And while the discussion about that piece of the measurement component is still ongoing, the purpose of this paper, paper one, is to begin discussions about the allocation principles. Specifically, this paper focuses on the rationale of why this project could support allocation of consideration of the total binding arrangement amount, and it also discusses the objectives for allocating consideration. So the project staff analysis begins on page 13 with a discussion about the reasons to support the allocation of consideration, in which the project staff believes that the need for allocation stems from the tentative decisions made by the board in both the categorization and recognition components of this project. During the development of the categorization principles, the board tentatively defined what binding arrangements and transactions are and clarified their relationship. And the board also tentatively decided that the transaction, not the binding arrangement, is the categorization unit of account, and that one binding arrangement can give rise to multiple transactions. In regards to recognition, the board has tentatively decided that the recognition unit of account is the distinct goods and services for Category A transactions, the transaction itself for imposed Category B transactions, and the point in which payments are due for Category B transactions for general aid and shared revenue. Because the recognition unit of account is not the binding arrangement, the project staff believes that allocating the total binding arrangement amount to each recognition unit of account is a natural extension of these decisions. And if consideration in a binding arrangement is not allocated to each recognition unit of account, we believe that the recognition tentative decisions to date may not be operable because each recognition unit of account relies on different attributes for the identification of the applicable recognition principle. So for example, if a binding arrangement contains only a Category B imposed transaction, then allocation could be simple in that the binding arrangement amount equals the transaction amount. If a binding arrangement contains a Category A transaction, Then that total binding arrangement amount equals the transaction amount, but then it would be further allocated to each performance obligation or in each distinct good or service, as that is the recognition unit of account. The project staff acknowledges that allocation may be more complex when transactions include multiple performance obligations or when a binding arrangement includes both Category A and Category B transactions. On page 15 there in the paper, there is a visual that shows how a binding arrangement would be allocated to each recognition unit of account, which we refer to as the allocated amount. And I do want to note that for Category B transactions, the visual shows the allocation process ending at the transaction level. However, while the recognition unit of account for imposed Category B transactions is the transaction, we do recognize that this is not the case for all Category B transactions, and the project staff plans to discuss the allocation of consideration for those Category B transactions in which that recognition unit of account is further disaggregated from the transaction at a later date. But nonetheless, the project staff does recommend that the total consideration in a binding arrangement be allocated to each recognition unit of account. We believe that this recommendation establishes an overarching approach to allocation, and then the project staff plans to return at a later date with more proposals specific to methodologies for such allocation. So that brings me to board discussion question 1. Does the board believe that the total binding arrangement amount should be allocated to each recognition unit of account? And the project staff recommends that it should be. And as it relates to task force members who provided feedback generally agreed with the project staff recommendations on all questions within this paper.
Thanks, Kara. Board member comments or responses to question 1? Jeff.
Kara, I'll start with a question because you pointed us to the chart on page 15. And one of the things that it took me a while to get, I think I eventually got there, is that for Category A, right, there's sort of potentially 2 allocations going on, right? So if there is a binding arrangement that has multiple Cat A transactions, you're going to have to allocate among those Cat A transactions, which you appear to do in Cat B because you call that an allocated amount. So there would be an allocation among transactions, and then to the extent to transactions had multiple performance obligations, you'd have to further allocate to performance obligations. Is that right? There's sort of potentially two levels of allocation going on.
Correct.
Okay.
Thanks, Jeff. Board member, other questions or any responses from board members on question 1? Jackie.
I support the staff recommendation on this. I agree with them. If we don't go through with the plan to do the allocation as they've outlined in the paper, I just don't see how all of the decisions we've made to date can go forward. So I agree with the staff decision on allocation as they've outlined it.
Thanks, Jackie. Robert.
I too concur with the staff recommendation. Good summary of of why it's necessary to go down this path. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Diane.
I agree with staff recommendation. I thought Kara did a really nice job of just going over the decisions to date that the board has made that all feed into this, and this is just all part of that process.
Thanks, Diane. Carolyn.
I agree with the staff recommendation based on the analysis that they presented in the paper and Kira's overview of that paper.
Thanks, Carolyn. Jeff.
Yeah, I agree too. I even took it to a higher level that, I see it as one of the overarching goals of the project, right, is to make sure that revenues and expenses are reflected in the most appropriate period. I don't see how you get there, right, without this allocation being done and being done correctly, right? So I think it's a pretty important part of what we're trying to accomplish here. So I agree with it.
Thanks, Jeff. So, Chris, do you have a response to question 1?
I do. I agree with the staff recommendation. I think that the considerations influencing allocation and the related cost benefit implications for entities following GAAP established by FASB are more complex and they involve different market practices based on the lack of contractual complexity in the government space and acknowledging that the FASB has that practical expedient of sorts. I do support the staff recommendation regarding the allocation of the binding arrangement.
Thanks, Chris. I agree for kind of reasons my fellow board members have said that we laid it out. Your team laid it out in the paper very well. Kara covered it. This really only makes sense and kind of follows along our categorization and our recognition decisions so far. I think any complexity or reductions of complexity will come in the details that as the team notes, will kind of follow with how we implement this overall. But I kind of don't see another path that makes any sense because of how this follows our prior decisions and just kind of faithfully represents the transaction or transactions that happened as a result or that we're trying to account for. So I agree.
Thank you. So the remainder of the paper focuses on the proposed objectives for allocating consideration, which it starts at the bottom of page 17. We believe that determining an objective for allocation is the first step in developing the allocation principles, as it will provide a foundation to the development of the methodology for allocation. To start, because this project covers a wide range of binding arrangements, that is, we have category A binding arrangements, we have category A transactions and category B transactions that could all be subsumed into different binding arrangements. We believe that there's a need to have more than one single allocation objective. So instead, the project staff believes that at this point, two distinct objectives we recommend. The first objective would be for allocating the total binding arrangement amount to each transaction arising from that binding arrangement. And then the second allocation objective would be the total transaction amount from a category A transaction to each performance obligation within that transaction. So in regard to the objective for the allocation of the total binding arrangement amount to each transaction, our starting point was to look at the board's categorization methodology, which differentiates category A transactions from category B transactions. Category A transactions are those in which each party has a substantive rights and obligations in relation to one another, and category B transactions are those that do not exhibit such substantive rights and obligations. This distinction is fundamental because it reflects the economic substance of each transaction as it is intended by the parties to the binding arrangement. And the project staff believes that if economic substance is ignored, there's a risk of misrepresenting the nature of the transactions. So for example, a binding arrangement that contains both category A and category B transactions, there could be an example in which we could be inadvertently treating a donation as if it were a performance obligation if we weren't keeping in mind the economic substance of each of those transactions. And so for this reason, the project staff recommends that the objective for allocating the total binding arrangement amount to each transaction within the binding arrangement should be that such consideration is allocated in a manner that provides faithful representation of the substance of each transaction. The project staff believes that this objective is suitable because it reflects the tentative definition of a transaction, and that is a transaction is simply not simply any contractual or legal arrangement, but rather it's a type of economic activity between the government and at least one counterparty that is evidenced by the binding arrangement. And without this principle, we believe that Category A and Category B transactions could be mischaracterized, and also binding arrangements that contain transactions both within and outside the scope of this project could also incorrectly be reported. With this objective, the paper brings up one other issue related to how allocation should work when a binding arrangement contains both transactions within and outside the scope of this project. And the project staff believes that our recommended objective to reflect the economic substance of a transaction also would support harmonizing those principles from this project with existing guidance that requires allocation of consideration. So standards such as Statement 87, 94, 96 already require governments to allocate consideration between clearly identified components. So for example, Statement 87 talks about a lease component and a non-lease component. And normally the nature of a non-lease component in a lease contract is a service component, which in most cases will probably be considered a Category A transaction falling into the scope of our project. The allocation methods used in those statements may differ from the allocation methodology ultimately developed in this project. And the project staff believes it'd be unreasonable to require governments to reopen prior allocation. For example, reallocating consideration between that lease and maintenance component to align with new proposals. So in our view, the board previously determined that allocation approaches and practical exceptions in those statements 87, 94, and 96, appropriately represent those underlying economic activities, and therefore the staff believes that those judgments should be remained intact and not affected by the proposals in this project. So with that, I have two board discussion questions on this topic. So the first one is, does the board believe that the objective for allocating the total binding arrangement amount to each transaction in the binding arrangement should be that consideration be allocated in a manner that provides a faithful representation of the substance of each transaction? And the project staff recommends that that it should be.
Thanks, Kira. Board member questions, responses related to question 2. Diane?
I agree with staff recommendation that the allocation to each transaction should maintain the economic substance of the transaction and not go down the road of the form or structure of the binding arrangement. That could take us in the wrong direction. And so focusing on that economic substance is important.
Thanks, Diane. Jeff?
Following up on, and are we doing 2 and 3 together, or we're just doing 2 right now? Just 2?
Just 2 so far.
Just 2. Okay. Yeah. Following up on what Diane just said, I think the objective should say economic substance and not just substance, right? Because I think that's what we're talking about, and that's what I just heard Diane say. So I think it should be economic substance. The only other question I had was, in looking at this, I recognize FASB doesn't have an equivalent for this. That theirs is sort of what the other objective will tackle. But we use the words, and here's where you guys will educate me as all the CPAs here. We say provides a faithful representation versus FASB just says depicts. Now we could have just said depicts or reflects the economic substance of each transaction. Is there specialness in this term, faithful representation, or should I just look at that as equivalent of saying depicts the economic substance of each transaction?
I just wanted to kind of correct something. I think that we're trying to keep alignment with the board's tentative decisions related to the definition of a transaction. And so that definition actually calls it economic activity. And so at this point, I think that's really what we mean is the faithful representation of the economic activity that is going on. And in terms of depicts, reflects, provides, that faithful representation, I guess that we kind of feel that's a drafting thing, and so we just kind of like to get into that at drafting, but that's basic. The basic idea is the same.
Jeff, I kind of noted that this idea of faithful representation, and actually those words are in our conceptual framework a couple of times. They're in cons 3 when talking about elements that are should be recognized in financial statements. That the financial statements are supposed to be a faithful representation, and then cons 1 has somewhat similar language that's a little more broad that says, you know, the information in financial reporting is meant to be reliable. So as it's talking about reliability, it says it should faithfully represent what it purports to represent. So to me, I kind of liked the terminology. I don't know that it's really all that different, or there's some special CPA version of what faithful representation means and that it's different than depict. But I kind of like that we used words from our conceptual framework to show it.
Got it. Thank you.
Robert.
I agree with the staff recommendation, and I also agree that the word economic needs to be in there in whatever sense, Pam, in terms of drafting, as Jeff proposed.
Thanks, Robert. Chris.
I also agree with the staff recommendation.
Thanks, Chris. Jackie.
I agreed with the staff recommendation. I like faithfully represents for the reasons you outlined, Joel. In fact, I even mentioned that in my comments that it goes right to our conceptual framework. So I like keeping those words in. I agree that economic goes in there. Economic goes to the heart of why we're doing measurement and what we're supposed to be doing with our financial statements. So I have no problem with that. Activities, if it aligns better than substance, I'm okay with that too. So I like what you proposed.
Thanks, Jackie. Carolyn.
I also agree with the staff recommendations and I'm just going to call it the edits that my colleagues and Pam suggested might be happening with some of the wording. And the rest I have is number 3. So I agree with the staff recommendation on question 2.
Thanks, Carolyn. I agree with the staff recommendation as well. I agree, Pam, that economic activity, because of the definition we have of transaction, is probably the best way to bring that economic in, if it works out in the drafting. I kind of like that. And then kind of my reasons for the faithful representation I've already kind of talked about with its groundings in our conceptual framework, and it just kind of flows and makes sense to me. I guess I think it was somebody else's point. I don't know what we would do if we didn't do this kind of. So I agree as well.
Okay. And then board discussion question 3. Does the board believe that allocation methodologies and practicality provisions in existing guidance, specifically those in statements 87, 94, and 96, should remain intact and not be disrupted by the proposals in this project? And the project staff recommends that allocation methodologies and practicality provisions in that existing guidance remain intact and not be disrupted.
Thanks, Kara. Board responses to question 3. Jackie.
I agree with the staff recommendation on this. Those statements were specifically called out as being out of scope. So I think that going back and messing with them probably doesn't make any sense. So I don't think this project should overlap or adjust or interfere with those statements unless we're going to change the scope of this project, which I don't think we are wanting to do. So I agree with the staff recommendation.
Thanks, Jackie. Robert.
I also agree with the staff recommendation. I thought the paper, particularly on page 20, kind of laid out the rationale and the summary at the top of 21. Again, getting back to relying on the type of economic activity, and don't mess with Texas, so to speak, on the existing standards.
Thanks, Robert. Carolyn.
I agree with the staff recommendation. There were lots of deliberations that went into the development of each of these statements, and I agree that they should be left intact and not overwritten by proposals in this project. I also suspect that providers and auditors will probably greatly appreciate this conclusion. So I agree with the staff recommendation.
Thanks, Carolyn. Chris?
I agree and support the staff recommendation.
Thanks, Chris. Diane?
I agree with staff recommendation. It's consistent with how FASB applied guidance that may also be covered in topics other than 606. But I think I agree with what Carolyn said too. I think that the preparers and auditors, these three have been a big challenge, and so they would appreciate us not changing them.
Thanks, Diane. Jeff?
Yeah, I think I agree as well. I mean, I guess what I think I hear everybody saying is, I mean, there is the instance, right, that you could have a lease that has, as page 20 goes through, that has a lease component and a maintenance component, right? And then the lease component would sit in 87 and be done there. The maintenance component then would come over here, right? Because it doesn't sit in 87, right? So I guess I think we just ought to be clear like that those would come over, right? Because even though they're in your lease agreement, that's not a lease accounting. That comes over here. It's got performance obligations. It will be analyzed through here. But I totally agree with the notion that whatever the rules are that are set in those other statements, that they are those statements. So in other words, if you come up and you determine it's a single lease unit, there's nothing to do here because it was determined to be a single lease unit over there in leases. So by that measure, I agree with the recommendation.
Thanks, Jeff. I agree as well in it, I guess following along with what others have said, those standards are out of scope. Transactions related to those standards, I guess, are out of scope for a reason because they have different characteristics, and that's why we address them differently in the guidance, and we should lead that guidance as it is. But to Jeff's point, there could be some interaction, some touching points in a way, depending upon, different types of binding arrangements. And so it's good that there's some theory which this standard would kind of work with those in that cases like the one Jeff pointed out, but it doesn't also necessarily mean that the standard has to follow and do the exact same thing those did because they had different characteristics. And so they might have different conclusions or practical expedients or whatever you might want to call them. And that doesn't mean this project has to do them either, but I do think it's important that fits with this, and it kind of does to the extent it needs to. So I agree with our path forward and thinking about it, but then the conclusion we reached.
Thank you. So the last topic in this paper discusses the project staff's recommendation for an objective for allocating the total transaction amount for a category A transaction to each performance obligation. As part of our literature review, we looked at FASB topic 606, which does provide an objective for allocating the transaction price among performance obligations. And that objective is that each performance obligation would be allocated an amount which depicts what an entity expects to be entitled to in exchange for transferring promised goods or services to the customer. The project staff believes that this principle can be adapted for this project. For category A transactions, the project staff believes that the allocation of consideration should directly align with when control of distinct goods and services are transferred. And this approach is consistent with the recognition principle the board has already tentatively supported, or decided upon, which is that recognition occurs when the government or the seller transfers controls of the distinct good or services to the customer. By aligning allocation with the seller's satisfaction of a performance obligation, we believe that, or the project staff believes that this could ensure that the measurement and recognition work together consistently within this project. So therefore, the project staff recommends that the objective for allocating the total transaction amount of a category A transaction to each performance obligation be to allocate an amount that reflects the amount of consideration in which a seller is entitled to for transferring control of the distinct good or service to the customer. I will note that our objective uses some words that are different than from the language in topic 606. Most notably, the one I wanted to bring up was that we recommend using the phrase is entitled to rather than expects to be entitled to. The phrase expects to be entitled to has a distinct meaning for FASB topic 606, as it is used in that guidance to clarify that the transaction price should not incorporate customer credit risk. So in other words, revenue in topic 606 is recognized on a gross basis without reductions for collectability concerns. And at this point, where we're at in our project, the board has not deliberated on collectability or customer credit risks. It's planned to be discussed at a future date. So therefore, we're recommending that wording change because we didn't want to add language that could provide some potential ambiguity on whether collectability or credit risk should be factored in when allocating consideration. So that was kind of the major wording change with the objective that we're recommending. So I'll pose board discussion question 4. Does the board believe that the objective for allocating the total transaction amount of a Category A transaction to each performance obligation should be to allocate an amount that reflects the amount of consideration that the seller is entitled to for transferring control of the distinct good or service to the customer? And the project staff recommends that that should be.
Thanks, Kara. Remember responses to question 4. Jackie.
I agree with the staff recommendation. As you already laid out in the paper, it aligns with what we've done so far. It matches the decisions we've made to date. I like the wording change. I think entitled to and expected to be entitled to are two very different things. And I think that use of the word entitled is less confusing. So I agree with the staff recommendation.
Thanks, Jackie. Robert.
I agree with the staff recommendation as well. The words is entitled to versus expects to be entitled to resonated with me. And I agree also with the recommendation of not using exchange in the objective because it gets to the transfer of control of the distinct goods or services that's already been tentatively agreed on.
Thanks, Robert. Chris.
I also agree, and I echo both Jackie and Robert's comments.
Thanks, Chris. Diane.
I agree with staff recommendation, and I do agree with the entitled to, and I think it makes sense for this project, and look forward to the discussion of collectability.
Thanks, Diane. Carolyn.
I agree with the staff recommendation, and I appreciate when we have the opportunity to use language that is in sync with other standard setters that we do that when we need to make a distinction for the government environment. I agree that we need to do that, and I believe that is the case in this particular, as you brought up in this particular question. So I agree with the staff recommendation.
Thanks, Carolyn. Jeff.
So I want to just make sure I get it, because we're saying, FASB says they call it expects to be entitled because they basically want to allocate gross, right? And that then they would deal with customer credit risk some other time. So are we saying that what our governments are going to allocate here is they're going to allocate net based on our discussions of customer credit risk that are to forthcome? Or are we saying that, no, they're going to effectively do it gross, but we're calling it gross in a different manner, not saying expects to be entitled to, but rather saying is entitled to. I've gotten now a little fuzzy about the expects to be entitled to, which is a gross thing to me. And so when we say is entitled to, that suggests we want a net allocation.
Well, the board hasn't deliberated that question yet. That's what we're going to be talking about when we bring a paper to the board soon on collectability. And so we're just trying to not convey that we're at this point using a gross method, or we're thinking that it's going to be gross like the FASB is, because we really haven't gotten to that point. So we're trying to make a distinction.
Okay, so then are you saying then, Pam, that this decision is tentative, and if we go back and make a determination on collectability, we could go back and change this objective to say expects to be entitled to?
Everything is tentative, of course, and we haven't really reached that point of just, first of all, formulating for sure what our recommendation will be, and therefore what we would recommend what language we would recommend using.
Yeah.
So Paulina has something further to say, though.
The issue is as exactly as Pam explained. There's a wording issue that we can't foresee what we're going to explain. But there's a bigger issue, which is the interplay of collectability and CECL, and definitely not a topic for discussion for the board today. But the word expect to be entitled in the FASB means something very specific, well beyond gross, which is then the subsequent accounting treatment for collectability and how it's handled. So I think I feel that as a team, you would be putting us in a very hard spot saying, well, when we come back and we agree to gross, then can we put it back as expected to be entitled? And then align to the FASB language when we mean something completely different, and then having to start reconciling all these issues. So there's definitely a wording issue that we wanted to be very deliberate to not align to the FASB because we're not there yet. But we know that the board has a very different existing guidance and preliminary review expressed in the PD. And so it's not a wording issue alone. It's also a conceptual problem that it would be very hard to go, oh, we're just like the FASB or not like the FASB. The board has taken a very different path in multiple issues associated with collectability. So it really, really encourage you to hold onto the collectability paper to get back to it, but to come back and reshape this to align with the FASB would be difficult.
I mean, I guess I could take the view, right, Paulina, that I wait until the collectability paper, right? And then sounds like, these things will be made more apparent to me, right? And so I can sort of on a tentative basis say, okay, yeah, I guess I'm okay with the way we have this objective phrase right now, subject to our discussions of collectability.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. I agree with the recommendation. I liked entitled to because it uses the binding arrangement. It seems to me to be the easiest starting point to allocate. It seems to follow along with the kind of importance of the binding arrangement in representing the transactions or being the place the transactions come from. And now we're using it to allocate what you're entitled to, which is one of the foundational, concepts we've used in this project, financial principles we've used in this project. Understanding that at some point we do have to deal with collectability, and we'll figure out how to put that in and when to put that in and how to put that in later when we get to that paper. But for now, as it kind of relates to a starting point, I think this entitled to makes the most sense based on everything we've decided up to now. Period. That didn't sound like the end of a sentence, but it was the end of the sentence.
All right. I think that's everyone, and I think that's it for this paper. So with that, I will turn it over to Mary Beth, who is going to be taking us through paper 2.
Thank you, Pam. The issues addressed in this paper are to consider if this project should reference customary business practices and what the consequences of including or excluding customary business practices into the assessment of terms and conditions of a binding arrangement are. The term customary is currently used in GASB guidance to describe certain procedures, terms, or operations. In FASB 606, Revenue Recognition Guidance, the concept of customary business practices is used to indicate a factor that is broadly considered in determining 1, whether a contract exists, and 2, how the terms and conditions of a contract are interpreted for the purposes of applying the steps of the model. Customary business practices in FASB 606 guidance represent unwritten yet consistently applied behaviors that create valid expectations. Routine discounts, permissive return policies, or accepted late payments are all examples of customary business practices. In the governmental environment, customary practices exist, but tend to be less prevalent than in private sector because governments typically rely on explicit, detailed terms to ensure enforceability and compliance. In Category B revenue transactions, such as property taxes, customary practices may arise when governments routinely apply grace periods or publicly post delinquent accounts, even if those practices are not explicitly outlined in statutory terms. Some of these unwritten practices, like grace periods, can have economic consequences and may affect recognition or measurement, while others, like publication of delinquency information, may not. For Category A revenue transactions, especially in sectors like healthcare or utilities, customary practices appear more often. For example, governmental hospitals routinely provide implied price concessions based on patients' ability to pay or insurance status. Similarly, unwritten norms such as grace periods, deposits, and penalties may exist in billing for governmental utilities. On the expense side, when governments purchase goods or services from private sector sellers, the customary practices of the seller often apply. Within the governmental environment, the project staff believes that revenue and expense transactions are generally evidenced by binding arrangements, which include a high degree of detail about terms and conditions. With that said, the board has tentatively decided that binding arrangements can also be informally construed or verbally agreed upon. If customary practices are not explicitly stated in a binding arrangement and this project's proposals were to ignore those terms and conditions, the project staff believes that outcomes about recognition and measurement may not be representational of the agreed upon economic activity. Therefore, the project staff would be concerned about the outcomes that such a rigid approach may produce, as governments may need flexibility to recognize and measure transactions based on their normal processes and operating procedures. For those reasons, we recommend that customary practices be included as part of the assessment of a binding arrangement. However, the project staff believes that highlighting customary practices throughout the model proposals may unnecessarily heighten concerns from stakeholders about the identification and judgment related to customary practices. Therefore, the project staff recommends incorporating the relevance of customary practices as part of the assessment of the terms and conditions of a binding arrangement without highlighting it prevalently throughout the proposals. Finally, the project staff recommends utilizing the term customary practices instead of customary business practices because governments may be engaged in both governmental and business type activities. The term customary practices is neutral in terms of which type of activity a given binding arrangement relates to. With that, I now pose board discussion question 1. Does the board believe that customary practices should be included as part of the assessment of any binding arrangement? And the project staff recommends that customary practices be included in a limited manner in this project. And task force members who provided feedback generally agreed with the project staff recommendation.
Thanks, Mary Beth. I appreciate you including the task force member comments. And I don't often enough thank the task force members, but to the extent they're listening, we really appreciate their input into the project and the time they take to review all these papers and provide that input. It is very valuable. So thanks. Shout out to our task force members. But thanks, Mary Beth. Board member responses to our only question in this paper. More questions, I guess. Jeff.
I guess I can start because I agree with the recommendation for several reasons. One is I agree that customary practices should be included because it's consistent with our prior decisions around binding arrangements can be verbal. And if you're dealing with a verbal binding arrangement, it seems to me you're pretty much dealing with customary practices for me to understand what that agreement contains. So I think this decision would be consistent with that. I also agree that we shouldn't highlight it because I agree with the staff pointing out that I could see governments being sort of uncomfortable with having to come up with this notion. And when I looked, in the attachment here at the myriad places that FASB uses customary business practices, that to be putting governments in the spot of having to, for all of these different things, explicitly having to consider that, I think would make them concerned. And then third, I agree with the alteration of customary business practices down to customary practices for the reasons that the staff has noted.
Thanks, Jeff. Diane.
I agree with everything Jeff just said. I agree with the staff recommendation. And the only thing that I would add is that I agree that the governments need to have the flexibility that would be afforded them under the customary practices.
Thanks, Diane. Chris.
I also agree. I think this is a really good catch because thinking through if we did not consider this on the front end and capture it, what it might mean to governments in that inclusion of those different types of circumstances could be significant. So I think, great job by the staff. And then as far as the business practices, yeah, I mean, that makes perfect sense to remove it. So.
Thanks, Chris. Carolyn.
I agree with the staff recommendation for all of the reasons that my colleagues have highlighted, and I appreciate Diane bringing up the flexibility part because that also is another reason why I was like, this is a good, I don't want to call it a catch, but this is a good provision to present to our prevent to our stakeholders or to the governments. So I agree with staff recommendation.
Thanks, Carolyn. Jackie.
I also agreed with the staff recommendation, basically for all the reasons that my colleagues have already indicated. I think if we have allow for implicit terms in the binding arrangement, we need to have some out for that. And I think that the customary practices allows for that. Leaving out the word business just makes sense in government because not everything we do in government is business. So I think that made good sense.
Thanks, Jackie. Robert.
I also agree with the staff recommendation for all the reasons that the other board members have stated, and I think the limited manner when you look at the excerpt from that was included as an attachment with the FASB hit that over the head over and over again, I think just limited is much preferred just to ensure that we have the flexibility that others have commented on.
Thanks, Robert. I agree with the staff recommendations as well. As Jeff, the way Jeff described it and articulated, I thought was really good. What I would add is I really appreciate the limited part and the place that you put it being with the binding arrangement kind of determination is the part of it that makes the most sense for government. I don't think this is going to be all that prevalent for general purpose governments, as you pointed out in the paper. Governments can't give one property taxpayer a relief from having to pay at a certain time without giving it to everybody. They're very rigid in their procurement practices because they have to be fair, they have to be open. They just don't have a lot of this, but as you point out, maybe hospitals, higher ed, maybe there are other places where they do have it. And general purpose governments might run into these oral arrangements for something in particular and these unique circumstances. And so I think we need to address it. I just think limited is the right way to address it because of that lack of prevalence, and doing it at kind of the binding arrangement being where we describe it makes the most sense because of oral binding arrangements and all the things that my fellow board members in the paper kind of points out. So I agree with where we are with this and appreciate it.
All right, I think that brings us to the end of the materials we have for you for this time. We're looking forward to our next meeting. We're working on topics related to changes in estimates, as well as contingencies and collectability, as we alluded to a few minutes ago.
Excellent. Well, thank you Pam and team, appreciate all the efforts as always on this big project. We look forward to the progress and the next papers that you have for us. That concludes our board meeting. And I was really productive couple of days. I appreciate everybody's, our teams getting us all ready. I appreciate all the deliberations and conversations with the board. Lots of good progress, and look forward to seeing everybody at the next meeting. But this meeting is adjourned. Have a great day, everybody.